Hi everyone! Today we're going to build an online resume using AWS. We'll build a page that looks something like this using HTML. We've got CSS for some styling, and then we've even got some JavaScript for interactivity here on our professional experience. Each one of these is clickable. These files are living in an S3 bucket that's configured to host a static website. That bucket is sitting behind a CloudFront distribution, so the Content Delivery Network, or CDN. And you'll also notice that up here, we are on a custom domain name, amberaws.com, on a secure connection, HTTPS, using a certificate that I set up from AWS Certificate Manager. So when you're done, not only will you have an online resume page, but you'll also have a real-life project that you can use on that resume to highlight your experience. This seems like a fairly simple project, but there's actually several moving parts. And by building something like this, it shows that you know about the different services and how they fit together. Incidentally, if you're looking for other projects that you can use to build your skills and your resume, I've linked 2 videos below in the description. These also use several services, and when you're done, you'll have a fully working web application that you can also use to highlight your skills. Okay, let's talk through what we're going to do. I've broken this into 3 parts. And if you want to go through all 3 parts, you do need to work through them sequentially because they kind of build on each other. But we're going to start with part 1, where we build a static website on S3. So we will create our code files. I'm going to get some help from ChatGPT with this. With mad respect to the front-end developers, writing HTML code and CSS from scratch is not really my jam. So I'm going to get some help from AI on this. You don't have to use ChatGPT, and I will also make my code available for download if you want to use that as a starting point. We'll then take that code and upload it to an S3 bucket and configure that bucket for static website hosting with public access. Moving on to part 2, here's where we're going to make everything work with a custom domain name for Route 53. I have a domain name that I've already registered with Route 53. You don't have to do that part if you don't want to. It is possible to use a domain name from another registrar like GoDaddy or NameCheap or something like that. I'll point you to an article with more details if you want to go that route. But we'll work through how to point your records to the S3 website so you can go to mydomain.com and get to your website hosted in S3. And then finally, we'll see how to make everything work on a secure connection on HTTPS using a certificate from AWS Certificate Manager. You can't apply that to an S3 bucket. You have to apply it to a CloudFront distribution. So we'll also set up that piece so that by the time we're done, we can just go to mydomain.com. That will go across a secure HTTPS connection to the CloudFront distribution and ultimately serve up our amazing resume. As far as what this will cost, it kind of depends on which parts you do. So for the first part, we're using ChatGPT and S3. Like I said, you don't have to use ChatGPT if you don't want to. You can code things from scratch. You can use the code that I provide. But if you do want to use ChatGPT, there is a free account that you can use. And then for S3, if you're still inside of the free tier, which is usually 12 months after you first create your account, then all of that should be free. If you're outside of the free tier, though, S3 is very inexpensive. It should really just be a few cents to host the simple files that we're working with. Moving over to the Route 53 piece, if you decide to get a domain with Route 53, these vary in price, starting from about $10 up to who knows, depending on the popularity of the domain name. Like I said, you don't have to get one of those. You can use a domain name from another provider. We'll have to create a hosted zone, and that will run you 50 cents per month. And then you're also charged for queries, basically how many people hit your domain name, and those will be 40 cents per million queries. So I think you're okay there. But if you go with Route 53, it will cost you just a little bit of money. And then on the last part, for the ACM certificates, those are going to be free. CloudFront could be free or a little bit of money, depending on how many requests are made. If it's just you and friends and family occasionally hitting the site, then we're probably talking just a few cents here as well. With all of that said, though, I would recommend that you check out this video that I have about AWS budgets. Always a good idea to set one of these up. This will alert you to your charges in case you accidentally left something on, or in case suddenly you have millions of people going to your domain name or something like that. Set up a budget for, say, $10 a month or $20 a month or something like that, and you'll get alerted if it looks like you're going to go over that. So always a good idea. All right, let's go get started. So for this part, we need to go create our files. And here's where I'm going to get a little bit of help from ChatGPT. This is not a course about ChatGPT, so if you're using it, I'm assuming you're fairly familiar. If you don't have an account, though, and you want to give it a try, just go to chat.openai.com. You can create a free account, which will give you access to GPT 3.5, a super capable model. I'm actually going to be using GPT-4, which requires the Plus account, which is $20 per month. But like I said, you can skip this entirely, write your code from scratch, which is actually probably the best way to prove your skills, especially for a resume, or you can get the code that I ended up with and use that as a starting point. But here we go. I'll just put in plain language what I'm trying to do here. So I'm creating an online resume for myself. It should be a single web page using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and then a little bit about the different parts of the resume. So we want a headshot image, different sections. Here's how we want to use the JavaScript. If you want to use JavaScript for something else, feel free to do that. Or you can even ask for inspiration on how you could use JavaScript in a resume. I'm going to do separate files for all of my code, and then ask if it can create the page for us. Okay, so with that prompt that I gave it, we have ended up with 3 different files. So we've got HTML, and for each of these, you can just copy the code by clicking that right there, and then just copy it into different files. This file needs to actually be called index.html. It's guessing that it should be resume.html, but you want index.html for that. We've got our CSS code here, styles.css, and then for JavaScript, a separate file. And for this example, the JavaScript comes into play with the employment history and that interactive timeline. So feel free to go back and forth with ChatGPT to get it just the way you want it. I think that's actually a really good skill, knowing how to work with these generative AI tools. Let me show you the code that I ended up with. I did go back and forth quite a bit on styling and formatting and so on. And I'll zip up these 3 files and link them in the description if you want to grab these as a starting point. Just a heads up though, make sure you do replace the headshot.jpg with your own headshot. I'm not providing mine because that would just be weird, but you do need a headshot.jpg in the same folder with these other files. And then I've just updated various things here, fictional information, obviously, about skills, employment, and so on. I've got my scripts file and my styles file as well. All right, so that's the code. Now we need somewhere for it to live. And this is where we're going to go out to AWS and create an S3 bucket. So add in the AWS console. I'll go to S3. And then we'll create a new bucket. Now a note in terms of naming here, the name of your bucket has to match the domain name that you're going to use to direct traffic to the bucket. For example, I'm going to use amberaws.com, and so my bucket name needs to match that exactly. Otherwise, we're going to run into trouble when we get into Route 53. So if you're using mysupercooldomainname.com or something like that, then make sure you're naming the bucket exactly that. I'll leave this in US West 2. Defaults for everything here. We are going to deselect this because we're building a resume that should be public and available to the world. This is generally not recommended if you're using S3 as internal storage for another application, for example. In our case, though, we're building a public resume that we want anybody to be able to get to. So we don't want to block public access, but you do need to acknowledge that you know what you're doing here and that you did that on purpose. So check that box. Everything else can be default, and then we'll create the bucket. Once it's created, let's go into View Details. Then there's a couple other things we need to do. First, we need to enable it for static website hosting. So the files that we're using, the HTML, the JavaScript, and the CSS, those are considered static website files. They don't require any server-side code to run. So all of these can live at S3. And we want to go all the way down to the bottom to static website hosting, edit, and then enable. The only other thing you need to change here is the index document, the home or default page for the website, index.html, and then we can save changes. And then we also need to add a policy that allows the contents of the bucket to be publicly available. So this is in addition to that check mark that we deselected earlier. We do also need a policy. So come into the Permissions tab, and then down here, Bucket Policy. We'll edit this, and then I'll paste some code in here. I will also link this little code snippet in the description for the video, so you can just copy and paste it. But you will need to update the bucket name right here. So my bucket name is amberaws.com. Update that with whatever name you're using. And this is allowing anybody, the star, to do a get object. So basically to read all of the objects in this particular bucket. Okay, and then let's save changes. And now let's go upload our code files to the bucket. Click on Objects, and then Upload. I've got the 3 code files here, plus the headshot. So again, make sure that you do have a headshot.jpg file in the same location as your code, and also make sure that you're dragging the code files over and not the zip file if you've downloaded everything. So I'm just going to grab all 4 of these, drag them over, and then upload. Okay, perfect. And then to test things out, we don't want to come into an individual file like index.html or something like that. We actually want to come back to Properties and then scroll down to the static website hosting section. And now you should have a bucket website endpoint here that we can launch to test things out. So I'll just open this up, new tab, and there we go. There's our masterpiece. But you will notice that it's not secure. So we're getting the little exclamation up here. We're just using HTTP right now and not HTTPS. And then we've also got this long domain name here. Normally users would want to just go to your custom domain like amberaws.com, which is what we're going to work on next, as in right now. So let's go over to Route 53 and work on a domain name. Back to the console and navigate to Route 53. If you need the basics of Route 53, then check out the video linked above and below. But from here, you could register a new domain name if you wanted to. We can check to see what's available. So nobody in the world has this domain.com. Hopefully. Let's check. And look at that. It's available for $13. So you could actually select this. It will take you through a cart and a checkout process, and then it just ends up on your AWS bill. I do already have a domain name with Route 53 that I'm going to be using. If we back up and come into hosted zones, if you purchased a domain name here, it would automatically create a hosted zone for you. You can kind of think of a hosted zone as just a container for the different records and rules that handle traffic from the internet, and that's what we're going to be doing. So I've got this hosted domain. I've got some records in here. But let's say that you have a domain from somewhere other than Route 53, like GoDaddy or NameCheap or something like that. You can use Route 53 as your DNS service. There's a lot of benefits to it, and it's just a lot smoother to operate with other AWS services. But you could still have the domain name registered with somebody like the GoDaddy or the NameCheap, for example. So if that's your situation, you would still want to create a new hosted zone from scratch. You would enter your domain name from GoDaddy or wherever it is. I won't go all the way through with this, but let's just do mytestdomain.com, do a public hosted zone, which is for routing traffic on the internet, and then create the hosted zone. And once you do that, you're going to get your name servers here. You would take these name servers to your current provider, GoDaddy, for example, enter those name servers there. Because everything is slightly different and it's going to be really tough for me to troubleshoot things, I will just leave you with that. And then I've also got an article here that I'll link below in the description. It's out on LinkedIn. And this might be helpful as well. It's got some screenshots and different things in here, and some good instructions to help you work with domains from external providers. Note that things like propagation are probably going to take a little bit longer with this. Generally, there's just more things that can go wrong. So I am going to use a domain that I purchased here in Route 53, and everything will just magically work, as we'll see. So I'm going to delete this hosted zone that I just created just so I don't get confused. Again, a hosted zone is really just a container for your records. So now I just have the original one for amberaws.com. And basically, when somebody goes to amberaws.com, what we want to have happen is route that request to our S3 website. To do that, I'll go to Create Record. The record name, I'm just going to go with the root domain here, amberaws.com, so I don't have a subdomain. I could set up a subdomain if I wanted to, but I'm just going to go with the root. The record type for what we're doing here is going to be an A record. And then we do want to toggle on alias. So alias is what will let us route to different AWS resources like S3 or Elastic Beanstalk or CloudFront or something like that. So we want to route traffic to S3. Region, my S3 bucket is in Oregon, US West 2. And then it should show up right here. Now, if your S3 endpoint is not showing up here, it's probably because you didn't name the bucket the same as your domain name. So that's why we had to name the bucket amberaws.com to match my domain here. So that's a pretty common gotcha. It's working for us, so yay. We're going to go with a simple routing policy and then create the record. Now this message up here is super handy. You can view the status of the propagation. It does take a little bit to push out these changes. So if I were to try to go to amberaws.com right now, and we're currently in a status of pending, it probably wouldn't get me to my S3 website, but now it would. So now we're in sync. I'll open a new tab, go to amberaws.com, and ta-da! Everything worked. Awesome. So we've got our custom domain routing to our S3 static website. All right, what's next? Well, next, if you haven't already, then go hit that like button. If you're enjoying the video, I would super appreciate it. It really does help the content spread to more people. Also think about subscribing for more content like this, and thank you so much. Okay, but really, we're going to move on to the last bit here of setting up a certificate and a CloudFront distribution. So let me go back to the console. I'll open up a new tab. And here we'll go to Certificate Manager. Now, very, very important for this one, we want to be in North Virginia, US East 1. If you create your certificate in another region, we won't be able to use it when we get into CloudFront, which is where we're going eventually. So very important that you toggle that region over, and then we're going to request a certificate. If you have a certificate from somewhere else, another authority, you can also import that here, but we're going to request a new one. We'll go with a public certificate, and next. The fully qualified domain name, I'm going to go with amberaws.com. You can also set things up for www.domain.com, and you can do that in Route 53 as well, but I didn't. So I'm just going to keep things simple with amberaws.com. Then you'll need to choose your validation method. Basically, Amazon wants to check that you actually own this domain and that you have the ability to modify the DNS configuration. We're going to go with the DNS validation. This will require us to add a new record in Route 53, which we totally can do. And then if you can't do that for some reason, you can't modify DNS configuration, then you'll have to go with email. But we're going to go with the DNS option. Key algorithm, we'll just go with defaults, no tags, and then request. So our request has a status of pending validation now, and then further action is needed. Let's view certificate. Now, I don't find it super obvious what you're supposed to do next, but there is some documentation. I'll just show you that quickly for future reference. So in here, you can find the steps to do the DNS validation or email validation. But scrolling down, what we want is this step right here, number 3. So in the domains section, back to our page here, the domains section, you should see this button, Create Records in Route 53, which means that you're using Route 53 as the DNS provider, which we are. We have permission to write, which we do, and the fully qualified domain name has not been validated yet, and it hasn't. So for us, all we need to do is just click on this button and then say Create Records. This will go create a new CNAME record for us in Route 53. So if I come back to Route 53 here, I have just these 3 records at the moment, but if I refresh, now I've got this 4th record, this CNAME record right here, and that's what we just created through Certificate Manager. So really pretty easy to get this hooked up if you're using Route 53 and you have all the right permissions and so on. Back to Certificate Manager. If we refresh, it looks like our status is issued, which is awesome. According to the documentation, the status can show as pending validation for up to 30 minutes. I have found that inside of that 30 minutes, though, I can usually still use the certificates. But in either case, we should be good to go because this one has got the green check mark. So we have the certificate now that will allow us to do HTTPS connections, but you can't use that certificate on the S3 website. Instead, you have to set up a CloudFront distribution that points to the S3 website, and then the certificate actually goes on CloudFront. So let's go to CloudFront next. I'll open up a new tab. I do have a video on the basics if you need those. Link above and below if you want to check that out. So we'll create a CloudFront distribution. The origin domain, this is basically where your stuff is living, your files. For us, it's in S3. And my bucket is actually the first one here. amberaws.com is the name of my bucket. When I select that, though, I'll get this message. This bucket has static web hosting enabled, which it does. If we plan to use this as a website, we do. Then we recommend using the website endpoint rather than the bucket endpoint. So this is the bucket endpoint here. All we have to do is click this button, and then very handily, it will update it to the website endpoint instead. Okay. There's a whole bunch of things here that you can just leave as defaults. We don't actually need to change anything until we get down here under Viewer. For this, we'll want to select Redirect HTTP to HTTPS. Scrolling down some more. You will need to select an option for the Web Application Firewall, or WAF. For us, we are not going to enable this. Just keeping things simple. And then coming down to Settings here. Here you want to add the item for an alternate domain name. Enter your domain, so mine will be amberaws.com. And then you also want to select your certificate here, so the one that we just set up in Certificate Manager. And also just the note here that it does have to be set up in North Virginia. So if you accidentally requested that certificate in another region, which I have done before, it's not going to show up here. So ours, though, should. Here we go. Perfect. Just one other thing to update. If we scroll down to the default root object, this will be the index.html page, or our default home page. And then create distribution. All right, successfully created. Yay! But that's a little bit deceiving. If you're to try to go to your distribution domain name right now, I'll just open up a new tab here. We can't actually get there. So this has not actually finished deploying, and you'll see that right here, the last modified message. When it's done, and then it will show a date and time in here. So I'll give it a minute or two to finish deploying, and then we should be able to get out to that domain name. Okay, now we have the last modified updated to a date and time. That's exactly what we wanted. So it should be done now. And if we were to come back to the distribution domain name, which I have in this other tab, let me refresh this. And there's our resume. Excellent. And you'll notice that the connection is secure. So I've got the little padlock right here. So our certificate is working on the CloudFront distribution, which is pointing to our files in S3. But remember, ultimately, we want to be able to go to amberaws.com, and that will show the resume. We don't want to go to this CloudFront distribution domain name. So we'll just need to go make one final update in Route 53 to make that magic happen. So back to Route 53, we want to update our A record. So this is the record that we created initially. Let me edit this. It's pointing to the S3 website endpoint. Now we want it to point to CloudFront. So let's update this. And then the distribution should find it for us. Here we go. Perfect. Let's save that. We'll view the propagation status. And in sync. Perfect. So let's come back to, actually I'll just close out of these tabs. We'll just start from scratch so we know we're getting the latest. And we'll go to amberaws.com. There's my resume, as we would expect. And we are on the secure connection with our certificate. Strong work, everybody. Nice job. So we've created a resume using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, put all of those into an S3 bucket, enabled static website hosting. Then I went into Route 53, set up our domain name and our records to point to that bucket. Then we created a certificate, hooked that certificate up to a CloudFront distribution, updated our Route 53 record to point to that distribution, and everything is working. Very cool. All right, before you get excited and go show everybody your resume, just an important reminder, if you do want to shut everything down here, then follow along with me. I'll walk you through what you need to delete. If you want to leave things running, the cost will depend on whether you're in the free tier or not. There might be some things that incur little costs here and there. So again, check out that AWS budget video to be notified just in case there's any charges that you weren't expecting. But let's go delete the things that we set up. We'll start by deleting the CloudFront distribution. So just select it. For this, you actually need to disable it before you can delete it. So let's start that. While that's running, we'll come back to Route 53. And I'll just clean up some of the records here. These records don't cost you anything, but they can just get a little bit confusing in the future if you're doing any work in here. So I'll delete the A record. Just select it and delete. We'll delete that CNAME record that was created for us by the Certificate Manager. Delete that one. Now the certificate that we created in Certificate Manager, we actually won't be able to delete this until the CloudFront distribution has disabled and is deleted. It will say that the resource is still in use. So we'll need to let this one finish running, and then we'll finish up with other deletions. So I'll pause the video and be back when this is done. Okay, once again, we've got the last modified with a date and time. So that means that the status is successfully disabled. And now, if we were to click on the distribution, we'll have the delete option. So we will delete. And now we can come back to Certificate Manager and delete our certificate. So let me just back up, make sure I've got the right one. I'll select the certificate and then delete. And confirm that. Just refresh. And that's gone. And the last thing is the S3 bucket and the files. So back here, I'll back up to buckets overall for me. And it's the first one in my list here, conveniently. I will select delete. Now the bucket is not empty. Obviously, we've got the 4 files in it, so you can empty the bucket. We have to say permanently delete and empty. So that just empties the files. That doesn't actually delete the bucket, but we can delete the bucket by clicking on the delete bucket configuration here. And then we'll need to enter the name of the bucket and delete the bucket. And with that, the final thing you need to do, if you haven't already, hit that like button for me, and also think about subscribing for more content like this. I hope you found it helpful, and thank you so much for watching.